Welcome to another episode of Warmaster's Workshop. Today we're going to be putting together or forming a Mandalorian costume backplate. We're going to be doing this out of plastic. Of course, there's many different materials you can use. You can use metal, you can use plastic, you can create one out of resin and fiberglass. But plastic is generally the easiest method that you can use for this. For this particular tutorial, we're going to be using 3mm Sintra or expanded PVC foam board. Same stuff that you can use to put create the rest of your armor plates if you want to. This also comes in 6mm, which is much more difficult to form than its thinner 3mm counterpart. Of course, the 3mm Sintra is much more brittle. The backplate that we have here today in front of us is a Jango Fett style backplate. Backplates, the Canon standard ones that you can find templates for, come in two real different varieties. You've got the Jango Fett, which is this one, and then you've got the Boba Fett template, which is much wider right here along this area. The actual wing here comes up a good probably another half an inch or so. So it's got a much more a larger wing that kind of sticks out more. Excuse me. But this is the Jango Fett. It's a little bit easier to manipulate than the Boba Fett. It also doesn't have the neck protector that the Boba Fett backplate has right in here. Also, there's a horseshoe, kind of a flat horseshoe in this area of the back plate that you can work in. I actually use a different piece of Sintra to cut that horseshoe out of if I want to actually make it flat and make it look like a Canon Django backplate, or even a Death Watch, Clone Wars Death Watch backplate. But to mold this, we're going to be using a dummy here, a tape cast dummy. And this is what I would suggest anybody to use when molding your backplate, is the duct tape dummy, because it's going to be very difficult for you to, obviously you can't mold the backplate to yourself, and it's very difficult for a friend to mold it to you, because for one, you're going to have to wear something fairly thick to keep the hot plastic from burning you or from being overly uncomfortable. Second thing is, your body's going to move as your friend is trying to form the hot plastic on you. So the best thing to do is just make a nice sturdy tape cast with some duct tape and fill it full of batting, like basically like pillow stuffing that you can get at any craft store, sewing store, Walmart, whatever. Fill it full of that till it's nice and firm and it doesn't easily want to bend. And you'll have yourself a really good, we call a buck, for making your back plate. And you'll be able to, to bend it forward. You'll be able to bend it to the side and really work really work the proper shapes in there the way they should be. All right, so the back plate itself, it doesn't require a lot of tools to do the plastic backplate, either out of Sintra or ABS or whatever you're using, as long as it's plastic. The main thing is heat. You want heat. Heat is the most important thing to mold this backplate appropriately. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to heat this up, and we're going to heat it up until we start to see it ripple a little bit. And when the plastic starts to ripple, that is when we're going to mold it. Now, we also need to make sure that we've got gloves. Gloves are very important because the plastic does get hot, and if you're not wearing gloves, you will burn yourself. It is hot plastic after all. So we're going to put our gloves on, and what I'm going to do is the where you want this to bend is you want it to come to about, you're wanting to come to about maybe 1.5 to 2 inches. I would say maybe like 1.5 inches. That's about what it is there, below the neck. Okay. And as we mold this, we're gonna mold it in different directions. But for right now, we're gonna start out getting the basic roll right in here. Okay, you want to roll this area right where the back of basically the scapula bones are, the back of your shoulders. We're going to roll it there first. So let's go ahead and get some heat going on it. We'll get that roll done, and that'll be the first part of our first step in doing this backplate. Also, make sure that you've got it centered on your tape cast as best as possible, because remember, it's going to take the shape of your tape cast, and if you don't have it centered well, you're not going to get a proper shape. So try to keep it centered as best as possible. It may not be absolutely perfect. You can work out some of the imperfections with the heat gun down the road after we're done getting the majority of the shape in. So I've got my heat gun turned up on high, and you want to make sure that you're doing this in a well-ventilated area, because Sintra does give off chlorine gas fumes. Luckily, my workshop is pretty big. I've got my windows open and a fan in the window, so I'm pretty good here. But you're going to start to see the Sintra get this ripple effect going on. It's going to kind of look wet. That's when you know it's warm enough to start bending or to start rolling. And I'm just moving my heat gun around on it here, and I'm focusing in the areas where I really want to get the maximum amount of heat. And I know I don't have a lot of time to work before this starts to cool down, so let's go ahead and get our first roll done here. And we're just going to hold it down. It's going to take some time to cool. And there we go. It's cooling down now pretty good. All right, now that we've got our basic clavicle roll in here, we're going to heat up each of these shoulder areas, and we're gonna bend them around appropriately. Now, one of the things you're really going to want to watch out for is this rise that's going to happen right through here. It's going to want to raise up here and kind of pull up. Okay, so we don't want that to happen. We're going to have to fight against the plastic, because it just, it's going to fight. We're going to have to fight it. We're going to have to battle it to win that battle. So I'm just heating this, basically we call a shoulder tab. Just heating this up with the heat gun here. And I'm kind of working from the corner of the neck on over. Now, you don't want to hover your heat gun over one area too long, or else it's going to cause it to, you'll scorch the plastic, and we don't want to do that. So now, as you can see, I'm holding it real tight here. And we're just going to hold it down until it cools. Now, these lines along the side here are my guidelines to show me where these bends need to take place. Now we're going to turn. I'm going to turn this just a little bit so that I can get this side next. And then here is where you're going to start to really see you're going to start to really see this lift up here. And I'm going to show you how we fight that. So let's go ahead and heat up this side. And then, of course, we hold that down too. Just be careful you don't hold it down too tight, because you don't want it to ripple. See, it's starting to ripple a bit there. And of course, to get that ripple out, you're going to have to reheat it. And then we're just going to let this cool. All right, now let's lift this off. Now this is our basic, we've got our basic shape. All right, we've got a basic shape going on here, but we've got a lot of work yet still, because you can see this gap here. We've got a pretty sizable gap. And then over here as well, we've also got a pretty sizable gap. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut these pieces and fold them under, okay? And by folding them under, it will create a nice sealed look here where you won't see these gaps, because the gaps will basically be closed off by this edge. So that's where we're going to go with this next. We've sat our Duct-Tape Dummy upright, and I've put on the collar plate here. Now, obviously, this isn't the collar plate that goes with a plastic backplate, but it doesn't really matter. If you've already got your collar plate made, you want to go ahead and put that on your dummy, because you need to figure out your clearance, the amount of gap between the collar plate and the back plate. And as you can see, there's a lot less gap on this side than there is on this side. So we're going to use this side here, our left side, as the kind of the primer, or the to what we want our clearances and where we want all of our lines to be. Now, what I like to do is take a ruler, and I'll go from the edge of the collar plate, sort of along along the inside of the back plate here, so that I can get a good idea of where I need to do some more cutting to even this up with the collar plate. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that, because this piece will now get trimmed off. And then, of course, we're going to do the same thing to the outside. I'm going to step around it here, and we're just going to measure. It's kind of difficult to see from this angle, but I've got the ruler basically sitting at the edge of the collar plate, and then coming along at an angle towards the rear of the back plate here. And then all I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to keep this angle from where I've got this Sharpie line here up to the outside back edge of the collar plate, because I don't want to lose that angle. So I'm going to just take and mark that so that I know where to trim. All right, and then we're going to do the same thing on this side. Now this side, there's not as much gap, so I'm going to measure the amount of open space I have between these two, and we're looking at about 7/8 of an inch. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this ruler and I'm going to mark back to 7/8 of an inch, which is right about there. Yep. And then I'm going to measure here, which we're literally touching right here. So then I'm just going to take my ruler here, and what I do is I set the ruler under the plastic, but up against the collar plate, and then I mark right where I can see that it's touching. And then I will make my cut line to match that. Oop. Make sure you don't get any pin slippage there. Alright, so let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and cut this off because I need this to be correct before we make our line back here. So I'm going to grab my not my Sharpie, but my trusty X-Acto knife here, and just gently score this piece right along our line. You don't want to cut into your dummy. So what I do is when I get down here, I just kind of make a little, just flick it towards myself. Another flick. I'm going to raise this up. There we go. Perfect. Now as we can see, we still have a little bit more overlap here, so we need to cut it. We need to remeasure there and cut that a little bit more. And now I'm going to switch to my pencil because the Sharpie mark would be too wide. But let's go ahead and measure this. It's pretty close. Again, the old saying is measure twice and cut once. But it's also always good to not cut enough than to cut too much, because if you cut too much, you can't put it back on, not easily. Alright, so I'm just going to use my ruler here as kind of my cutting guide. Just to make my initial cut. And then we just follow that. And we lift it up, there we go. Alright, that's pretty close. Yep, that's pretty close. Now, we'll take our Sharpie back and we will measure this. Again, right from this outside corner edge to the tip of our Sharpie mark here. Just like that. Alright, so now we're just going to cut these two tabs off right here, and that will allow us to start working on folding in these side pieces. Alright, so we've got our shoulders trimmed down now, and as you can see, they meet up pretty good. We're still going to have to do a little bit of finish up work to them. We're going to have to make this cut. I like to make this cut right here a little bit more horizontal and have it look less diagonal. So we're going to have to do that on both sides, but we'll come back to that. We'll wait and do that actually at the end. So what we're going to do now is we're going to cut this piece right here, and we're not going to cut it all the way off. We're just going to cut it enough so that we can heat it and bend it perfectly over. So we're going to do that across this whole piece. We will actually cut through the top part here. where this bend starts, which is right about, let me get a pencil here and I'll mark. We're going to start cutting this piece here, probably right about there, where the arch and the shoulders start. And I'm going to mark it on this side as well, right about there. And I just want to make sure those are fairly even marks. Bring this down a touch. And just to make sure that those marks are straight or are even on both sides, because it will matter. If those marks are not straight, the back plate will not. It won't curve properly, because what happens is, actually, let's just lay this down. These pieces, when we heat them and bend them under, they're actually going to support the back plate being in that shape. Now let me grab a tape measure here. So we're going to measure on this side. From the top of our mark down is actually 3 and I'm going to mark it at 3 1/8. It's almost 3 1/8, but I'm going to go ahead and mark it at 3 1/8. And then we'll turn this. We're going to do the same here. Oh yeah. Oh, too far off, but we were off far enough. Let me make sure that's right. I think that might be 3 1/4. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's 3 1/4. So we weren't too far off. Alright, so where this bend starts is where we're going to actually cut all the way through. The rest of this, we're going to just basically score it enough so that we can bend it under. And then we'll run some epoxy along this seam, some epoxy glue, to make that nice and strong, and then we'll put some on the inside as well. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this, and then we'll come back and we'll start to bend it. I'm going to take it off the tape cast here, and we'll start to do our bends, and I'll show you how this works. I went ahead and did the left side to show you, just to give you an idea of how we want this to look afterwards. And I'm going to go ahead and fold the right side up. But what we do is that little corner, we heat it up and we'll mold it around, and then we'll also, so we score this one time all the way down, and then we heat this whole side here and we bend it around. Okay, you just bend it right around. You want to make sure you keep it nice and warm though, because if it's not warm, if it's not hot, when you try to bend this piece of Sintra, it will snap and you'll snap this whole side right off. We don't want to do that because we don't want to lose the strength. See, it's actually a lot stronger with this piece folded around here. So we'll cover this up with some epoxy, so that's not a problem. You'll never even see that this score line here, this cut is even here. So I've already went ahead and we've got this cut, and then you can see how we measured down to our 3 1/4. We cut down to where our 3 1/4 inch measurement was here, and I basically just kind of folded this piece back out so it's nice and straight, or straight as I can get it, without applying heat. I don't want to really apply heat to this piece until we're ready to curl it around. I went ahead and scored down through here, just one score. It's not far through at all. It's barely even through the into the plastic. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and heat this side up, and then I'm going to use this flat edge here on my little table. I'm going to use this flat edge to bend this piece around. Let me turn this so that you guys can see it a little bit better right here. I'm going to use my flat edge here to bend this around, but first let's go ahead and heat it up. And what we're going to look for here is, as this area starts to get hot, this score line is going to start expanding and it's going to make itself visible. So you'll see this as the heat gun heats it up. Now you can start to see the score line appear there. I'll hold it up to the camera a little bit better. You can see how it's widening out. And I am holding the heat gun pretty close to the Sintra. I don't want the heat to spread out too far into the plastic. I'm trying to keep it localized, but my heat gun's pretty hot, so I'm keeping it moving just so I don't scorch the plastic. But you're seeing that line really start to expand right about now. And it looks like it's about soft enough to bend. So let's go ahead and start bending it here. And it should just fold right over very nicely. And then I press down on it here so I can get a nice sharp edge. It's not really burning my hand because I'm keeping my hand moving. I've got a little spot there that you can see there's a little spot here that I didn't cut through. So I'm going to nick that just a little bit, just so that doesn't keep this piece from bending. But I'm going to heat this up a little bit more just to sharpen this edge a bit better. And you can use, you can always use a piece of PVC pipe or some kind of a hard, I'm going to use this Sharpie here just to work that edge nice and sharp. And you don't want to lose your, you want to make sure you don't lose your bend here, your roll. All right, so now we need to bend this piece right here. So we're going to localize our heat. I kind of lean it put it at an angle. We're going to localize our heat along that piece. And you can see how it's starting to get hot because the edges are curling. And then I just take my fingers here and I just sort of curl it around. And I want to follow the line here. So that it goes just inside of this little, you'll see this little raised piece. I want it to go just inside of that raised piece so that it follows this curve. So we're going to heat that a little bit more. Oop, excuse me. I'm also going to heat this right here. I think we might have pulled a little bit of our curl out. Let's get that pulled back down. We'll keep working this piece. It's okay if it looks like it's a little lumpy because we'll sand that, and we'll sand that lump right out of there so you won't even see it. And I think we're pretty good at this point. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to place some super glue in here and clamp it and let that dry. just right here where I know that the Sintra is touching. And again, you want to make sure you get that. This piece here needs to stay inside of that little divot. And you can see we've got a little bit of some lump there, but like I said, we'll sand that out, and you'll never even know it was there. Now we'll let this dry, and we'll come back to it. We'll do our we'll do some cleanup. We're going to put some hot glue on the inside here, just so that's on these inside edges, just so they stay nice and firmed up, and then we should be good to go. We've got our backplate here, nice and the edges nice and squared off, and we've let our super glue dry. Now you could use epoxy on those edges, but the super glue it holds just as good for what we're doing here. We put a little bit of hot glue in on this edge, and the same on this side with this edge, just to strengthen that up. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to clean these edges up here and make this look like more of a seamless piece by putting it on the sander. You can use a mouse sander for this. You can even use a piece of sandpaper. I'm just using my sanding pad attachment for my drill press. And this is a 220 grit sanding pad because I don't want to eat through this plastic too fast. So let's go ahead and just start sanding this down. And we're just really very lightly hitting the corner here. I want to check this edge just to make sure it is nice and yeah, it's pretty nice and flat. We're going to switch over to this side now. And just doing the same thing like we did on the other side, watching it to make sure we get a nice, even, flat surface. And then we just gently put it under here to take that little flashing off that comes up as you sand this. Alright, so that's about as good as we want to do with the actual sanding attachment. So let's take the backplate back over to the table, and we'll do a little bit of hand sanding on these edges. Alright, so we're just going to just hit up the edges here with sandpaper, and I'm using just a scrap piece of 220 grit again. You don't really need 80 grit for this Sintra. It's just too prone to want to eat through. And all I'm doing is just making sure that these edges are kind of rounded, because you're going to want to fill those in with an epoxy. You could also try to fill that in with hot glue. I don't know that I would recommend that. I would just stick with using an epoxy. Epoxies make really, really good fillers. Now, if we wanted to, we could always add this piece right here, and then work it in with some plumber's epoxy so we can make it look nice and flush. And doing that would actually add this flat surface if you wanted to add a jet pack or anything like that. Now we'll turn it on this side and we'll go ahead and get here. And the good thing too is if there's any lumpiness there, the sandpaper just pulls it right out. But you want to make sure you go down this whole thing, because what happens is with this score line is when you heat it up, the Sintra spreads and it actually makes a kind of a little lip right here. You want to get that lip sanded off. And just keep feeling it with your fingers. You'll be able to feel if that lip is still there. It'll be kind of rough at the edge. You want this edge to be relatively smooth. But you can see here, I mean, this backplate it's pretty sturdy at this point. Folding these edges in like this instead of simply just heating them and curling them in, when we score it and we fold it in and we put these the tips up here and roll them under like that, this creates a much more solid surface that is actually, I mean, it's pretty heavy. Let's see if it'll, you know, this metal, my shears here, this thing probably weighs a good 3 pounds, 4 pounds, and it sits on there pretty sturdy. So you can do this with 6mm Sintra as well. Just remember that 6mm always is going to require more heat to bend it like this. And then any places that look like they may have a rise in them, sand those down. You want to try to keep those lines nice and straight. I'm going to hit this piece right here. Also, make sure that you go over your edges with your sandpaper as well. Dull those edges down. You don't want to keep these edges sharp. If you do, it can cut you. Sintra can really cut through skin pretty easy if you're not careful. Yeah, very important to get these edges nice and rounded down. Now, if you're a bigger person, you don't have to fold these edges in quite as much. You can leave them out, and you can actually fold these wings in like halfway. Like you can mark in the Django pattern, and even on Jango Fett's cannon armor, these actually stick out more, and these wings fold in. Now, on the Clone Wars armor, you see these more straight, the way it is here. So personally, I don't care which way. I mean, it's all as good as the other, really. Either way looks just as good in my opinion. So, of course, you want to make sure we're getting right here too in the horseshoe, or at least that's what I call it, the horseshoe. We sand all around in here, the inside and the outside edge. Sometimes it's easy to just double the paper over like that so you get both edges at the same time. And then don't forget to round these corners. Always round the corners. You'll be happy that you did. It doesn't take a lot of sanding work really to get these edges. There's just a lot of edges on a backplate. You know, like I said before, it is the largest single piece of armor. So you want to make sure that you're getting all these edges. You don't want to make yourself sorry because you didn't. Now here's what our backplate looks like on the inside. Everything is nice and sanded down. If you have, like, you know, like you can see on here, there's a little bit of a dent right here. Don't stress that. Remember, that's weathering. You can always use that as weathering and say, you know, whether you're paint up appropriately there and say, oh man, look, I got in a fight and I got a dent. Weathering is good. All right. Just finishing off these edges here. Now, some people might ask, why wouldn't you just fill this with hot glue? Well, the problem with hot glue is that it's difficult to get hot glue to fill in like that, and then when you sand it and go over it, oftentimes it turns fuzzy, okay? And then that gives you problems with your edge, because then it looks really weird. It's very difficult to lay hot glue down like that and not have it look like hot glue. So I would always suggest to not use hot glue and just build it up with some epoxy. You can even use plumber's epoxy if you want to roll out some plumber's epoxy and work it in the cracks, and then let it harden. And then after it hardens, after it's cured, come back and then sand it down so you don't see the plumber's epoxy. You could even use the JB weld if you wanted to use JB weld and go in there. But either way, you need to put something in there. So I am going to put some epoxy in here. I will fill this up with epoxy, and then I'm going to sand it down, and then we're going to come back and we're going to look at our finished backplate that's ready to, at that point, prime and paint. What we did with our backplate after we finished sanding it down was we took some of this right here, which is basically it's 2-part epoxy putty. It's also called plumber's epoxy, and you just cut off what you need, and then it's you knead it together. There's a gray and a black, and once you knead those two parts, those part A and part B together, then it creates a very almost rock hard epoxy substance, and we use that to fill in these seams that we had from bending the where we cut and bent the backplate over, where we did these wings here. The wings, that's the term I like to use for them because they are kind of like wings. But as we heated it up, this whole seam here just expanded. Plus, it was scored, and there was just no way to sand that down and keep that a sturdy area on the backplate. So we used epoxy putty in there to basically cover that and make it sturdy. So once you prime it and paint it, you really don't see it. Now, after we put the epoxy on there, I used my mouse sander and just switched between 80 and 220 grit sandpaper. Once I had gotten it down almost flush to the plastic there, that's when I switched from the 80 grit to the 220 grit, just so I didn't blow through the plastic with the 80 grit, because it will definitely eat through Sintra 80 grit sandpaper. And you still retain, even though these sides have now been epoxied on there, and they've also been glued here at the top, you still retain the ability to mold these a little bit more if you need to. If you lost some of the curve when you heated up the sides here, you can still heat that up and mold that back over. Now, I wouldn't get too crazy with it, because if you do, it might actually break, and we don't want that. We've already put a lot of time into making this, so that's really about it. At this point, all you've got to do is prime it and do your weathering and paint it. So altogether, it probably, you have to wait all night for the epoxy putty to dry, but if it wasn't for that, if you could find something else to use instead of using the epoxy putty, you could build one of these in, a couple hours at the most. It's not as difficult as it seems. It's just a very precarious piece because it is so big. That makes it difficult, just because of the size. But other than that, it's not a hard piece of armor to make, as far as, it's not a multi-piece armor, it's not a multi-part piece of armor or anything like that. It's just one piece of plastic. It's just getting it to do what you want it to do, because it's so big, is what's difficult. So that's really about it for the backplate. And I hope that you really, are able to build your own backplate after this. If you enjoyed this tutorial, you can help support the cause by going to our Patreon page. It's just patreon.com/warmastersworkshop. You can, sign up to support the workshop there. We've got, plenty of different reward levels with some really awesome rewards up to and including some armor sets. So you can also head to my webpage at mandalorianuniter.com. I've got you can buy the same patch and challenge coin you get as a reward off Patreon. You can buy that on the website. And just, throw me a line on my Facebook page at Mandalorian the Uniter on Facebook. If you have questions, you can shoot me a question there. I will answer it. I don't know of any questions that I haven't answered so far. So I'll always take some time out of my day to answer your questions if you need to. And I'm always happy to share my knowledge on this. But go out there, grab yourself some Sintra or expanded PVC foam board, and make some backplates. The same method works with really any type of plastic. So, again, thanks for coming out to the workshop, and we'll see you on the next episode of Warmaster's Workshop.